What you're about to hear is a story told by people who believed it completely. For the ancient Greeks, the gods were not metaphors. They were not symbols or abstractions. They were real, breathing, meddling presences, as tangible as the sea wind before a storm, as close as the voice you hear when you're about to make a decision you already know is wrong. Zeus sat on Olympus and watched the affairs of mortals the way a man might watch an anthill. Curious, sometimes amused, sometimes moved to intervention. Athena walked among soldiers in disguise. Apollo steered arrows in mid-flight. Aphrodite whispered into the ears of kings. In this story, we take that world seriously. When a goddess appears, she appears. When a god bends fate, fate bends. This is not a story about whether those things are literally true. It is a story told in the spirit in which it was first told, as a great, sweeping account of human pride, love, grief, and war, with the gods woven through it all like threads of gold in dark cloth. Make yourself comfortable. Let the story carry you. The trouble, as so many great troubles do, began at a party. The occasion was a wedding, the marriage of Peleus, a mortal king, to the sea nymph Thetis, who was so beautiful and so powerful that Zeus himself had once considered marrying her. He had been dissuaded by a prophecy that Thetis' son would be greater than his father. Zeus, who preferred to remain the greatest power in creation, stepped graciously aside and arranged for her to marry a mortal instead. So all the gods came to the wedding on Mount Pelion, and it was a magnificent affair, feasting and music, and the light of divine presences filling the mountain air. All the gods came, that is, except one. Eris, the goddess of discord, had not been invited. And Eris, who was very good at her work, noticed this. She arrived anyway, not to cause a scene, not to shout or rage, just to leave a gift. She set a single golden apple on the table among the wedding gifts. It was inscribed with 3 words, "For the fairest." Then she left. 3 goddesses reached for it almost simultaneously. Hera, queen of the gods, wife of Zeus, sovereign of heaven and earth; Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, gray-eyed and formidable; and Aphrodite, goddess of love, desire, and the particular madness that overcomes otherwise sensible people at the worst possible moments. Each one believed with complete sincerity that the apple was hers. Zeus, who was wise enough to know that choosing between his wife and 2 of his daughters was a problem with no good solution, declined to judge. He appointed instead a mortal man to make the choice, a young prince named Paris, son of Priam, king of Troy. Paris was, by most accounts, extraordinarily handsome. He had grown up tending sheep on the slopes of Mount Ida near Troy, not yet fully claimed by the palace life that awaited him. He was young, romantic, and perhaps not ideally suited to the task of judging goddesses. Each goddess in turn offered him a bribe. Hera offered power. She would make him king of kings, a ruler whose dominion would stretch across the known world. Empires would fall at his feet. His name would be spoken in every court from Greece to Persia. Athena offered wisdom and skill in battle. She would make him the greatest warrior who had ever lived, undefeatable in war, brilliant in strategy, a man whose genius would be studied for generations. Aphrodite offered him the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris gave her the apple. He was young and the most beautiful woman in the world, Aphrodite told him, was Helen, wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta. A small complication, she admitted, but nothing insurmountable. Helen's beauty was not merely a matter of appearance. It was, by the accounts that have come down to us, something almost supernatural, a quality that made men lose their reason, that made them set aside the things they knew to be true and act instead on pure, overwhelming feeling. She had not had a peaceful life even before the war. As a girl, she had been abducted once already by Theseus, the hero of Athens, and had to be rescued by her brothers. Her father, the mortal king Tyndareus, had been so overwhelmed by the number of men who wished to marry her that he feared whichever man he chose would be attacked by all the others. It was Odysseus, king of the small rocky island of Ithaca, who suggested the solution. Odysseus was not the richest suitor, nor the most powerful. But he was, perhaps, the cleverest man in Greece. He proposed that all of Helen's suitors swear an oath before the choice was made. They would each accept whoever was chosen, and they would all come to that man's defense if Helen were ever taken from him by force. The suitors swore. It seemed a reasonable formality at the time. Helen chose Menelaus. He was not the most dazzling suitor, but he was kind, and he was the brother of Agamemnon, the most powerful king in Greece, which was its own kind of security. They married, and by most accounts were happy together, in the way that quiet happiness settles over a life when the storms have passed. Paris arrived in Sparta as a guest. This was in itself a sacred relationship in the Greek world. The bond between host and guest, Xenia, was protected by Zeus himself. To violate it was not merely rude, it was impious. It was a transgression against the gods. Menelaus was generous. He welcomed Paris into his home, fed him, entertained him. He treated him as a brother. Then Menelaus was called away, a funeral in Crete, unavoidable family business, and left Paris in his home, in the care of his household, and in the company of his wife. What happened next has been debated for 3,000 years. Did Paris seduce Helen? Did he abduct her? Was she a willing participant in her own departure or a victim? The ancient sources are not entirely consistent. Some say she went willingly, swept up in Aphrodite's influence, her rational mind overwhelmed by something that felt, in the moment, like love. Others say she was taken by force while her husband was away. What is not in dispute, when Menelaus returned from Crete, Helen was gone, and so was Paris, and so were a great many of the palace's treasures. Menelaus stood in his empty home and understood, with the cold clarity that comes after shock, that the oath his wife's old suitors had sworn was about to be called in. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, commanded the largest and most powerful force in Greece. A great king among kings, ambitious and formidable. A man who understood that the theft of a Spartan queen by a Trojan prince was not merely a personal insult to his brother. It was an insult to every Greek king, and an opportunity that a man of Agamemnon's nature could not pass up. Messengers were sent across Greece. The oath was invoked. One by one, the kings and heroes began to muster. Odysseus came, though reluctantly. He had a young wife, Penelope, and a newborn son, Telemachus, and he had heard a prophecy that if he went to Troy, he would not return for 20 years. When the messenger came, Odysseus tried to pretend he had gone mad, plowing his fields with salt, behaving erratically. But the messenger placed the infant Telemachus in the path of the plow, and Odysseus swerved to avoid him, and the pretense was over. Achilles came, or rather was sent. His mother, the sea nymph Thetis, the same Thetis at whose wedding this whole disaster had begun, knew that her son would die at Troy. She had been told this. She disguised him among the women of the court of Lycomaids on the island of Skyros, hoping to hide him from the war. But Odysseus found him, with a trick involving a display of weapons and an instinctive reaching for a sword. And Achilles came willingly enough, because he had also heard the other half of the prophecy, that if he went to Troy, his name would live forever. Achilles was 17 years old. He brought with him his beloved companion Patroclus and his immortal horses Xanthus and Balius, children of the west wind. More than 1,000 ships gathered in the harbor at Aulis. It was the largest military force the Greek world had ever assembled. There were kings from Mycenae and Sparta, from Ithaca and Salamis and Argos, from Crete and Thessaly, and a dozen other kingdoms. There was the great Ajax, strongest man in Greece. There was Diomedes, who would prove himself nearly the equal of Achilles in the war. There was Nestor, oldest of the Greek commanders, whose role would be to counsel and remember. And then the wind died. The fleet sat becalmed for days, then weeks. The sails hung still. The ships could not move. Agamemnon sought answers and received them in the form he least wanted. The goddess Artemis was angry. She demanded a sacrifice. Specifically, she demanded the sacrifice of Iphigenia, Agamemnon's own daughter. This is one of the darkest moments in the entire cycle of stories. Agamemnon was a man who wanted Troy, who needed Troy, who had built his kingship around this expedition. And he was a father. The two things could not both survive. He chose the expedition. His daughter was brought to Aulis under the pretense of being married to Achilles and was sacrificed at the altar of Artemis. Some versions of the story say Artemis relented at the last moment and swept Iphigenia away to safety, leaving a deer in her place. Others offer no such mercy. The winds returned. The fleet set sail. Back in Mycenae, Iphigenia's mother, Clytemnestra, Agamemnon's wife, sister of Helen, understood what her husband had done. She began, quietly, to plan her own response. But that is a story for after the war. Troy, which the Greeks called Ilion, stood on a hill in northwest Asia Minor, commanding the approach to the Hellespont, the narrow strait that connected the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea. It was by any measure a remarkable city. Its walls were legendary, said to have been built by the gods Apollo and Poseidon themselves. They were broad and high and had stood for generations, and the Trojans trusted them with the quiet confidence of people who had never seen them breached. King Priam ruled from within those walls. He was old by the time the Greek fleet appeared on the horizon, old and experienced, and in possession of a large family, 50 sons and many daughters, the product of a long reign and multiple marriages. Among those sons was Hector, who commanded the Trojan army, and Paris, who had started all of this, and Cassandra, who was a daughter and a prophet. Cassandra is worth pausing on. She had been given the gift of prophecy by Apollo, and then, when she refused his advances, cursed so that no one would believe her. She stood on the walls of Troy as the Greek ships appeared and said clearly that the city would fall and everyone would die. She had been saying this for years. No one listened. Priam gathered his council. The walls were strong, the army was ready, and there was also the matter of divine support. Troy had the favor of several gods, including Apollo and Ares, god of war. The Greeks had the favor of Hera and Athena, still nursing their grievance from the judgment of Paris. Poseidon shifted allegiances. Zeus tried, with limited success, to remain neutral. The war, both sides believed, would be decided not just by men, but by heaven itself. The Greek fleet crossed the Aegean and arrived off the coast of Troy. Getting ashore was its own challenge. The Trojans came down to the beach to resist the landing, and a prophecy had circulated that the first Greek to set foot on Trojan soil would be the first to die. A young warrior named Protesilas leapt from his ship before anyone else. He was killed within moments, but the landing was made. The Greeks established their camp on the beach, drew their ships up onto the shore, and the siege of Troy began. It would last, by the reckoning of the ancient sources, 10 years. 10 years is a long time. The Iliad, the great poem by Homer that is our primary source for the war, takes place in a matter of weeks during the 10th year, and yet even from that fragment we can build a picture of the whole years of inconclusive fighting on the plain before the walls of Troy, neither side able to deliver a decisive blow. The Greeks unable to breach the walls, the Trojans unable to drive the Greeks back to their ships. The war was fought in the old heroic manner, individual champions meeting in single combat before the watching armies, with the fate of battles sometimes hinging on who could put down whom. This was a world in which a great man's personal excellence, what the Greeks called arete, was a military force in itself. On the Trojan side, the greatest of these men was Hector. Hector, eldest son of Priam, was everything a prince should be. Brave, responsible, deeply devoted to his family and his city. The kind of man who could inspire others simply by being present. He was not fighting for glory or for treasure. He was fighting because the city he loved was under threat, and it was his duty to defend it. When we meet him in the Iliad, it is the human moments that stay with us. Hector removing his helmet so as not to frighten his infant son. Hector saying goodbye to his wife Andromache at the gates before returning to battle, both of them knowing, in the way that people know things they cannot say aloud, that they may not see each other again. On the Greek side, there were two great pillars. The first was Ajax, also called Aias, or the Greater Ajax, to distinguish him from a smaller, lesser Ajax who was also at Troy, who was the strongest man among the Greeks. Massively built, slow to move, but nearly impossible to stop, Ajax was the shield and the anchor of the Greek army. Where Ajax stood, the line held. The second was Achilles, and Achilles was something else entirely. Achilles was the greatest warrior who had ever lived. This is not a minor claim, and in the world of the Iliad it is taken seriously. When Achilles fought, men fled. When he entered a battle, the tide shifted. He was faster than other men, stronger, more terrible in his anger, more brilliant in his killing, his armor made for him by the divine smith. Hephaestus shone so brightly it was said to resemble fire. He was also, by temperament, incandescent. Achilles burned. Everything he felt completely his loves, his loyalties, his hatreds, his griefs. He was close to godlike in battle and close to ungovernable in anger, and these two qualities would define the entire arc of the war.
His closest companion was Patroclus, who had been his friend since childhood, quieter than Achilles, gentler, the person who could reach him when no one else could. Their friendship is one of the great relationships in all of ancient literature, and its ending would be the engine of the Iliad's final catastrophe. And then there was Odysseus, not the strongest or the fastest or the most beautiful. Odysseus was nevertheless indispensable, the one who solved the problems that could not be solved by force. He was the Greeks' strategist, their negotiator, the man who could talk himself into and out of almost anything. The gods had given him a mind like a maze, and he used it. On the Trojan side, meanwhile, Paris himself was a mixed presence.
He was beautiful and charming and a reasonable archer, but he had none of his brother Hector's gravity or courage. The war he had started by following Aphrodite's gift sat uneasily on him. He preferred the bedroom to the battlefield and knew it, and so did everyone else. The Iliad begins with a single word, menon, anger. Specifically, the anger of Achilles. Everything that follows flows from this. In the 10th year of the war, Agamemnon and Achilles quarreled. The immediate cause was a woman, Chryseis, the daughter of a priest of Apollo, who had been taken as a war prize and given to Agamemnon. When her father came to ransom her back, Agamemnon refused. Apollo responded by sending a plague down on the Greek camp. The plague spread through the army for 9 days. Bodies were burned on the beach. The omens were terrible. Achilles called an assembly and demanded the truth. A prophet named Calchas confirmed what many suspected: Chryseis had to be returned, and without ransom, or the plague would not stop.
Agamemnon, furious at being forced to give up his prize, agreed, but announced that he would take Achilles' own war prize, a woman named Briseis, as compensation. The insult went deep in this world. Prizes taken in war were not merely possessions. They were a public measure of a man's honor, his worth, his standing among his peers. To have his prize taken, in front of the assembled army, by the man who was supposed to be his commander but was not, in Achilles' view, his better. This was something Achilles could not absorb. He came very close to killing Agamemnon on the spot. His hand was on his sword. Then Athena appeared to him, visible only to Achilles, and talked him back from the edge. Kill him with words. She counseled. The reckoning will come. Achilles withdrew.
Not merely from the quarrel, but from the war itself. He took his Myrmidons, his soldiers, back to his ships and refused to fight. And he asked his mother Thetis to petition Zeus. Let the Greeks suffer without me. Let them see what they have thrown away. Zeus, who owed Thetis a favor, agreed. The difference was immediate. With Achilles absent, the Greeks lost their greatest weapon. The man who had been keeping the Trojans penned behind their walls by sheer force of presence. Now Hector led the Trojan army out onto the plain in full force, and the Greeks found themselves giving ground. There were still great moments of heroism. Diomedes had a day of extraordinary fighting during which he wounded not one but 2 gods in battle, Aphrodite, whom he stabbed through the wrist as she tried to protect her son Aeneas, and then, staggeringly, Ares himself, god of war. Ares fled, screaming back to Olympus, which tells you something about Diomedes. Ajax fought magnificently whenever the line needed to hold. Odysseus kept the army from breaking on its worst days. But the Greeks were pushed back. The Trojans reached the ships. Fire was brought to the hulls. The destruction of the entire fleet, the Greeks' only way home, seemed suddenly, terrifyingly possible, and still Achilles sat in his tent.
Patroclus watched the Greeks suffer. He watched the wounded being brought back from the plain. Men he had known for 10 years. He watched the ships burning at their edges, and he could not endure it. He went to Achilles. He did not argue or command. He simply told Achilles what he was seeing and what it was doing to him. If you will not fight, Patroclus said, let me fight in your place. Let me wear your armor. The Trojans will think Achilles has returned, and they will fall back in fear. Let me give the Greeks a chance to breathe. Achilles agreed with conditions. Drive the Trojans from the ships, but come back. Do not pursue them to the walls. Do not try to take Troy. Just push them back and return.
Patroclus put on Achilles' armor, the god-forged armor, the armor that blazed like fire, and rode out at the head of the Myrmidons. And the effect was exactly what Achilles had predicted. The Trojans, seeing that armor, believing Achilles had returned, wavered, Patroclus fought brilliantly, fiercely, well beyond anything his experience had prepared him for. He drove the Trojans back, he saved the ships. He killed Sarpedon, a son of Zeus himself, Zeus watching from Olympus, grieving, unable to intervene without breaking the order of fate. And then, caught up in the momentum of his success, Patroclus forgot the instructions. He pursued the Trojans toward the walls of Troy. He was fighting on the plain before the city when Apollo appeared behind him, literally, physically appearing from the divine plane to intervene in the mortal world. The god struck the helmet from his head, the spear from his hand, the armor from his back. A Trojan spear found him first, and then Hector came forward and delivered the killing blow. Patroclus died on the plain before Troy. When the news reached Achilles, something in him broke. The grief of Achilles is one of the most raw and overwhelming moments in ancient literature. He did not grieve quietly or with dignity. He threw himself on the ground and tore at his hair and howled, and the sound carried to the sea, and his mother Thetis heard it from the depths of the ocean and came to him. He told her that Patroclus was dead. He told her he was going to kill Hector, and Thetis told him what she had always known, that Hector's death was the sentence on his own life. If he killed Hector, he would die at Troy, and soon, Achilles said, "Then let me die." She could not talk him out of it. Instead, she went to Hephaestus, the divine smith, and asked him to make her son new armor, because the old armor, the armor Patroclus had worn, was now on Hector's back. Hephaestus worked through the night and made armor so magnificent that it was as much a work of art as a piece of protection, a breastplate, a helmet, greaves, and a shield, so elaborate and beautiful that Homer spends hundreds of lines describing it. In the morning, Achilles went to Agamemnon. He was done with the quarrel, he was done with sitting, he was going back into the war. Agamemnon apologized, and meant it, and returned Briseis, and offered a great gift of reconciliation. Achilles accepted it with the distracted grace of a man whose mind was already somewhere else. When Achilles appeared on the plain, the reaction was exactly what his absence had promised. The Trojans who had been advancing faltered and then broke. Men who had been fighting bravely turned and ran simply at the sight of him. Achilles killed with a speed and ferocity that made the plain run red. He drove the Trojans back toward the river Scamander, and when the river itself rose against him, the river god enraged by the bodies piling up in his waters, Achilles fought the river too, and the fire god Hephaestus had to intervene to turn the river back. He was looking for Hector, and Hector, who was brave, was also not a fool. He watched Achilles coming and understood with absolute clarity what was happening. His generals urged him inside the walls. His mother wept from the battlements. His father begged him. Hector stood his ground. He had made his decisions, done his duty. He would face this. And then, at the last moment, when Achilles was almost upon him, Hector ran. He ran around the walls of Troy 3 times while Achilles pursued him, and it is one of the strangest images in the entire poem. 2 of the greatest warriors in the world, circling the city walls like men in a dream, neither able to stop. Athena intervened. She appeared to Hector disguised as his brother, and suggested they turn and fight together. Hector stopped. He turned. He drew his sword. And then the figure beside him was gone, and he understood that he was alone, and that the goddess of wisdom had just tricked him, and that this was the end. The 2 men exchanged words before the final confrontation. Hector asking for his body to be returned to his family, Achilles refusing, his grief still burning too hot for mercy. Then Hector threw his spear, and it glanced off Achilles' god-made shield. He drew his sword and charged. Achilles drove his spear into the gap at Hector's throat, the one place between helmet and breastplate where Achilles knew the armor was thin. Hector fell. What Achilles did next was not honorable. He knew it. The watching armies knew it. The gods, watching from Olympus, knew it. He pierced Hector's ankles and threaded a leather strap through them and tied the body to the back of his chariot, and he drove around the walls of Troy, dragging Hector through the dust. On the walls, Priam and Hecuba watched their son's body being defiled. Andromache, Hector's wife, heard the commotion and came to look. Their infant son was in her arms. She fainted when she understood what she was seeing. For 12 days, Achilles refused to release the body. He drove it around the walls each morning. The Greeks held games in Patroclus' honor, and Achilles slept badly and could not eat. and the grief did not diminish the way grief is supposed to. On the 12th night, Priam did something extraordinary. Guided by the god Hermes, the old king walked alone and unguarded through the Greek camp into the tent of Achilles and fell at his feet. He asked for his son back. He invoked the memory of Achilles' own father, an old man far away, also waiting and grieving. He said, "I have done what no man has ever done. I have kissed the hands of the man who killed my son." Achilles wept. Priam wept. They sat together in the tent, two men in grief on opposite sides of a 10-year war, and something in Achilles softened. He returned the body. He gave Priam 11 days without fighting, so that Hector could be properly mourned and buried. The Iliad ends there with the funeral of Hector, tamer of horses. With Hector dead, Troy had lost its greatest defender. But the city had not fallen, and would not fall easily. New allies arrived. Penthesilea, queen of the Amazons, leading a force of warrior women whose reputation preceded them like a storm. She fought brilliantly on the plain before Troy, and the Greeks struggled against her until Achilles met her in battle and killed her. It was said that when he pulled off her helmet and saw her face, he felt something very close to grief. Then came Memnon, king of Ethiopia, son of the dawn goddess Eos, a fighter who was Achilles' equal. Some said, the battle between them was watched by both armies and by their divine mothers, Thetis and Eos, who hovered above the battlefield in barely concealed anguish. Achilles killed Memnon too. And then the prophecy began closing in. It was Apollo who guided it. Apollo, who had never forgiven the Greeks and never forgiven Achilles in particular, leaned down from Olympus and nudged the aim of Paris's arrow. The shaft flew from the bow and struck Achilles in the heel, the one vulnerable place on his body, the spot his mother had held when she dipped him in the river Styx as an infant, seeking to make him invulnerable. Achilles fell. The greatest warrior in the world died on the plain of Troy with an arrow in his heel, and the Greeks stood over his body and wept, and fought off the Trojans who came to claim the corpse. Ajax carried the body back to the ships on his shoulders, while Odysseus held the Trojans back. They buried Achilles and Patroclus together, as Achilles had asked. But still Troy stood, and still the war continued, sustained now by stubbornness and investment, and the momentum of 10 years. The Greeks sent men to inquire about the conditions for victory, and the conditions kept multiplying. They needed the bow of Heracles, which had been left with a man named Philoctetes on the island of Lemnos. Philoctetes had been abandoned there years before. He had suffered a wound on his foot that would not heal, and the smell had driven his companions away. He had been alone on Lemnos for 10 years, hating the Greeks, particularly Odysseus, who had been the one to leave him. Odysseus and the young Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, brought to Troy after his father's death to fulfill another prophecy, went to Lemnos to retrieve him. The mission required diplomacy and cunning, and in the end the god Heracles himself appeared to Philoctetes and told him it was his fate to go to Troy. Philoctetes came, his wound healed on the journey, and his arrows found Paris on the battlefield. Paris was wounded and retreated to the mountain nymph Oenone, his first love, whom he had abandoned for Helen. She had the power to heal him and refused. Paris died of his wound on the mountainside, and when the news reached Oenone, she threw herself on his funeral pyre. They also retrieved the Palladium, a sacred statue of Athena kept in the temple in Troy, on which the city's protection was said to depend. Odysseus and Diomedes slipped into the city at night, found the statue and brought it back to the Greek camp. Troy's defenses were being stripped away, one prophecy at a time, but the walls still stood. It was Odysseus who thought of it, or so the tradition holds. If the walls of Troy could not be broken, they would have to be circumvented, and the way to circumvent them was not with more spears or more ships. It was with something the Trojans would never expect, something that asked them to open their own gates. The plan was this: the Greeks would build an enormous wooden horse, large enough to hide men inside. A group of the best Greek fighters would conceal themselves in the hollow belly of the horse. The rest of the fleet would sail away and hide behind the nearby island of Tenedos, out of sight. To all appearances, the Greeks had given up and gone home. They would leave the horse on the beach, and they would leave behind a single man to tell a story. The man chosen for this role was Sinon. a Greek who was reportedly a nephew of Odysseus and had inherited some of the family talent for persuasion. His story was carefully crafted. He had quarreled with Odysseus and the other commanders, he would say, and been left behind as punishment. He hated them. As for the horse, it was a religious offering to Athena, made large so that the Trojans could not bring it through their gates, because if they did, Athena's favor would pass from Greece to Troy. Every detail of the lie was designed to make the Trojans not suspicious but eager. The very danger the story warned against, taking the horse inside, was what it was engineered to make them want to do. When the Trojans came down to the empty beach and found the abandoned camp, the abandoned horse and the weeping Sinon, reactions were mixed. Many were jubilant. 10 years of war, and the Greeks were gone. Gone. The relief was overwhelming, the kind that makes people careless with reason. Some were not convinced. Cassandra came to the beach and said, with the clarity of true prophetic vision and the futility of the curse that had been laid on her, that the horse was a trap and the city would burn. No one listened. A priest named Laocoon was more direct. He took a spear and hurled it at the horse's side, and the hollow wood rang out, clearly hollow, clearly large enough for men. He declared that he feared Greeks, even bearing gifts. He was interrupted before he could make further argument by a sign so vivid and terrible that it silenced the entire crowd. 2 great sea serpents came out of the water, wrapped themselves around Laocoon and his 2 sons, and crushed them to death on the beach before retreating back into the sea. The Trojans took this as divine confirmation. The gods had punished Laocoon for his impiety. The horse was sacred. It should be brought inside. They broke open a section of the city wall to make the opening wide enough, because the horse was too large for the gates. Cassandra screamed and was restrained. They brought the horse inside, garlanded with flowers. Troy celebrated that night. After 10 years, the war was over. The enemy had sailed away. The horse stood in the citadel as a trophy of their survival, a monument to divine favor. The Trojans feasted and drank deeply. The wine flowed freely. The music played. Children who had been born during the war and had known nothing but the siege now heard what peace sounded like. In the palaces and the streets and the temples, the city celebrated with the relief of people who had carried something unbearable for a very long time and had finally been able to set it down. Helen, we are told, walked around the base of the horse that night. She called out the names of several Greek warriors, imitating their wives' voices, perhaps testing, perhaps torn between the 2 worlds she had lived in. Inside the horse, men gripped their weapons and held their breath. Odysseus is said to have physically restrained one man who nearly answered. Troy grew quiet. The feasting wound down. The fires burned low. The city slept. In the deepest part of the night, a single light appeared on the shore, a torch held by the Greek woman Helen, or by Sinon, depending on the telling. On the sea behind Tenedos, the Greek fleet stirred inside the horse. The Greeks felt it stop moving. They were in the citadel. Odysseus found the latch and opened the hidden door. They climbed down in silence into the sleeping city. They went to the gates, they killed the guards, they opened the gates, and the fleet came in from the sea. What followed was savage and fast and did not spare the innocent. Fires were set in multiple places. The Trojan warriors who woke and found their city already burning still fought. Hector's father Priam at the altar of Zeus, Aeneas carrying his old father on his back through the chaos, the city's treasures being seized, the temples desecrated. Priam was killed at the altar, his sons were killed, the women of Troy were taken as slaves and distributed among the Greek commanders. Menelaus went to find Helen. He came with his sword drawn, and then he saw her, and the sword was put away, and she was returned to his ship. Whether this reconciliation was immediately warm or whether it took time, the sources disagree, but Helen of Troy sailed back to Sparta and eventually was said to have lived to old age, beloved, somewhat mythologized even in her own lifetime. Troy burned through the night. By morning, the walls that the gods had built were broken. The towers that had looked down on the plain for generations were rubble and ash, and the plain before the city was quiet in the way that only places of great violence eventually become quiet. This is where we stop. The Greeks would face their own trials on the journey home, storms and monsters and years of wandering. Agamemnon would return to Mycenae only to be killed by his wife Clytemnestra, who had been waiting. Odysseus would not see Ithaca for 10 more years. The gods themselves, having spent their divine energies on a decade of war, would begin to slowly recede from the world, but Troy was gone. The greatest war of the ancient world was over. The story had begun at a wedding, with a golden apple and a question about beauty. It had passed through 10 years of courage and cruelty and love and loss. It had given the world Achilles and Hector, 2 men who could not both survive, both of whom the story loves equally. It had given us the image of a wooden horse and the sound of hollow wood. And now the fires on the plain of Ilion are dying down. The smoke is rising. The sea is very still. Let the quiet come in. You have heard the whole story. Let it settle around you like the ash that settles after fire, gently, slowly, covering everything over in a fine, soft gray. Rest now.